So the first case that we're going to talk about is the case of Brown versus Board of Education, or the first Brown versus Board of Education, which was decided in 1954. Now, we talked about this a little bit before when we were talking about segregation and Jim Crow laws, and we talked about Plessy versus Ferguson. Now, Plessy versus Ferguson is the case that says separate is equal, okay? This is 100 years before. This is where it was the issue of different train cars for black people and white people. And the Supreme Court said that this was okay because the cars, no one was being treated unequally because the cars for black people and white people were the same. So what we end up having, because of Plessy versus Ferguson and the other cases that we discussed, is that Jim Crow ends up being upheld in the South, and you end up having a complete separated system with legal segregation for black people and white people. Now, this begins to change with Brown versus Board of Education. We already watched the documentary that talked about some changes with this, but how this was really the start of the Supreme Court seeming to be on the side of racial equality. So what Brown versus Board of Ed held is that at the very least in the field of public education, separate can't be equal. So it overruled Plessy versus Ferguson. So Plessy versus Ferguson is no longer good law. And at the very least in public education, separate isn't equal, okay? So in the case, this was several states combined, which said that black people and white people can't go to the same school, okay? And this was public education. So what the Supreme Court ends up holding is that separate public schools can't be equal because of inferiority and a stigmatic harm. And what this is it's a stigma that subordinates a racial group. And the Supreme Court says that educating black students and white students differently affects the hearts and minds in a way unlikely to ever be undone. That education was one of the most important things that state governments do. It's the foundation of good citizen, and it's something that all American citizens need to have. And it's a right that needs to be available to everyone on equal terms. The opinion stresses repeatedly how incredibly important education is. And the court ended up looking to studies and modern authorities that suggested that legally imposed segregation hurts the mental and emotional development of children based on these psychological studies. So coming out of Brown versus Board of Education, this first one in 1954, we know that you can't have separate schools for black students and white students, at the very least when you're talking about elementary and high school level public schools. Now the issue with Brown versus Board of Education, and we're going to talk through in the next cases, is it isn't clear what theory of equality we're using, okay? So there's three main different theories of equality that we could be using in Brown versus Board of Ed. So the first one is about racial classification, okay? So here the law classifies on the basis of race. The law itself in these places said white students and black students have to go to different schools, okay? The law explicitly treated black people and white people differently. And so maybe that's the problem here. Maybe the Equal Protection Clause means that there can't be a different law for black people and white people. So that's one thing that Brown versus Board of Ed might mean. Now, a second thing that Brown versus Board of Ed might mean is about the effects and the stigma, okay? The problem here is that having separate schools for white students and black students hurt black students. And it made a stigma be on black students. The black students weren't as good, weren't as smart, shouldn't be mixing with white students. And what we really ended up having in this country was a caste system, and a system where some people are better than others, and white people were considered better than black people, and that's what these laws did. So maybe what Brown versus Board of Ed is saying that we shouldn't be having caste systems in this country, and we're gonna undo whenever the government starts having these caste systems. I'm gonna let these sirens go by for these lecturings in the time of coronavirus. third thing the Brown versus Board of Ed might stand for is an integration theme. And that this is really about education. That it's good for students to be educated together in public schools. It helps democracy. It helps people get to know each other. It helps break down stereotypes. So maybe Brown versus Board of Ed is about, it's actually good to have integration in schools. Now, it's important that we're not entirely sure what Brown versus Board of Ed meant, because whether you think Brown versus Board of Ed is saying we can't classify on race, or we need to get rid of a case system, or this is just limited to education, is going to have a lot of effects on the next cases that come up, because what if is people being treated unfairly not in education? Is separate but equal still okay in other fields? Or what about affirmative action? Is it okay to treat white people and black people differently if it's to make up for these past harms against black people? So it depends what theory of Brown you end up using. And the next videos are going to talk about the next cases.